The truth was never meant to be known. For nearly a century, the photograph had remained tucked away in the darkest corner of the family archive, deliberately obscured by those who understood its terrible significance. And perhaps it would have stayed there forever, this seemingly unremarkable wedding portrait from 1908, were it not for the curious eyes of someone who recognized what others had failed to see. Or perhaps what they had desperately tried to forget. What appears at first glance to be nothing more than a faded memento of a bygone era has become, in the hands of those who know how to read its silent testimony, evidence of a crime that generations labored to conceal. You are about to learn what was meant to stay hidden, to peer beyond the veil of history that powerful forces meticulously constructed. The question is, once you know, what will you do with this forbidden knowledge? You've seen them before, these formal, stiff wedding portraits from the early 1900s. The unsmiling bride and groom, positioned rigidly before the camera's unforgiving eye. The Victorian and Edwardian eras had strict protocols for such photographs. They weren't meant to capture joy or spontaneity, but to document a solemn contract, to establish a record of family lineage, to pronounce to society that a proper union had been formed. The subjects seldom smiled, partly due to the long exposure times requiring stillness, partly due to the cultural gravity assigned to marriage, and partly due to the prevailing fashion of formal portraiture. These were, after all, expensive endeavors, often costing the equivalent of a week's wages for a working-class family, not an occasion for frivolity. But this particular photograph, taken in a small studio in rural Wisconsin on June 17, 1908, carried a secret that went beyond the customary solemnity of the era. At first glance, it appeared perfectly ordinary. A handsome young couple, she in a high-necked white lace gown, he in a dark wool suit with a standard pocket watch chain. Behind them, a painted backdrop depicting classical columns and romantic foliage. Between them, the prescribed distance that spoke of propriety rather than passion. Nothing to distinguish it from thousands of similar portraits produced in photographic studios across America at the dawn of the 20th century. Yet something wasn't right, and once you saw it, truly saw it, you could never unsee it again. The photograph came to light in 2017, when Elizabeth Carrington, a doctoral student researching her family's genealogy, discovered it in a collection of memorabilia inherited from her great-aunt Martha. Tucked inside an ornate album of faded velvet, the cabinet card bore only the simple inscription, Margaret and Thomas, wedding day. No surnames, no studio mark. No date, though the clothing and photographic technique placed it squarely in the first decade of the 1900s. The absence of these details would later prove to be the first deliberate act of erasure in a long campaign of familial amnesia. Carrington might have simply catalogued it alongside the dozens of other period photographs in her collection had she not noticed something peculiar about the bride's hands. Unlike most wedding portraits of the era, Margaret wore no ring. Instead, clasped in her pale fingers was what appeared to be a small locket or pendant on a delicate chain. This wasn't entirely unusual. Victorian and Edwardian jewelry often contained sentimental messages. Lockets might hold a lock of hair, a tiny portrait, or even a minuscule written note. Such tokens were common in an age obsessed with symbolism and hidden meanings. But it was the positioning of the pendant that caught Carrington's eye. The way Margaret's thumb pressed against it seemed deliberate, almost desperate. As if she were trying to communicate something that her carefully composed face could not. It was this observation that launched Carrington's investigation, an investigation that would unravel a complex web of deception spanning 3 generations and culminating in a truth so disturbing that those who knew it had worked tirelessly to bury it beneath layers of carefully constructed fiction. I became obsessed with that pendant, Carrington would later write in her journal. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she held it. It was like she was screaming through time, using the only means available to her. The Edwardians were masters of symbolic communication. Everything from the flowers in a bouquet to the positioning of a brooch could convey messages that words could not. Was Margaret's grip on her mother's locket a coded signal? And if so, what was she trying to say across the vast expanse of time and forgetting that separated her from those who might understand? Carrington's first step was to determine the precise date of the photograph. The cabinet card format had been popular from the 1870s through the early 1900s, gradually being replaced by more modern photographic techniques after 1910. The bride's dress offered more specific clues. The high neckline, the fitted bodice with slight puffing at the shoulders, the use of lace overlays, all pointed to the 1905 to 1910 period of Edwardian fashion. The groom's suit, with its slightly wider lapels and the cut of the vest, corroborated this time frame. But it was a small detail in the background that provided the decisive clue. Partially visible in the painted backdrop was a distinctive column design that Carrington, through painstaking research, managed to attribute to the Westfield Photography Studio in Millfield, Wisconsin. The studio had been in operation from 1899 to 1914, when it was destroyed in a fire that claimed the life of its owner, Augustus Westfield. Further investigation of the studio's business records preserved in the Millfield Historical Society revealed that the specific backdrop had been purchased in early 1908 and was used for less than a year before being replaced. This narrowed the time frame considerably, but Carrington still needed to identify the couple. The absence of surnames on the photograph's inscription struck her as unusual, particularly for a family keepsake. In an era obsessed with lineage and proper documentation, such an omission suggested an intention to obscure, rather than preserve, identity. It was the first thread in a carefully woven tapestry of concealment that would gradually unravel under her persistent investigation. Westfield's studio, like most photography establishments of the era, had maintained meticulous records. Each negative was numbered, each sitting documented in elegant, flowing script, the date, the client's name, the number of prints ordered. But when Carrington examined the ledger for 1908, she found something strange. The entry for June 18th, the day after the wedding date that would later be confirmed, showed only a number and the notation, "Wedding Portrait," no names. The only such anonymous entry in the entire year's records. This pattern of erasure, of deliberate omission, would become increasingly familiar as Carrington's investigation deepened. It was as if someone had systematically removed Margaret from the historical record, leaving only the faintest traces of her existence. Traces that, without the photograph as a starting point, might never have been detected at all. The breakthrough came when Carrington cross-referenced her family tree with marriage records from Millfield and the surrounding counties. Between January and December of 1908, only 3 marriages were performed, in which the bride was named Margaret. 2 could be eliminated immediately. One couple had moved to California shortly after their wedding, and the other, Margaret, had married a man named William, not Thomas. The third record, however, showed a Margaret Blackwood marrying Thomas Carrington, Elizabeth's great-grandfather, on June 17, 1908. This was puzzling. Family records indicated that Thomas's wife, Elizabeth's great-grandmother, had been named Catherine, not Margaret. According to the family Bible and numerous oral histories, Thomas and Catherine had married in 1909 and had their first child, Elizabeth's grandfather James, in 1910. "I thought I'd made a mistake," Carrington recalled. "I spent days double-checking my research, convinced I'd misread something or confused 2 different Thomas Carringtons. But the records were unambiguous. Thomas Carrington, age 24, had indeed married Margaret Blackwood, age 19, in June 1908. Yet by April 1909, less than a year later, he had married Catherine Donnelly, with no record of divorce or annulment from Margaret. It was as if Margaret Blackwood had simply vanished from the historical record and from family memory, to be replaced by Catherine. This discovery led Carrington to the Millfield Gazette's archives, where she hoped to find an announcement of the Carrington-Blackwood wedding. What she found, instead, was far more disturbing. In the July 3, 1908 edition, barely 2 weeks after the wedding, a small item on page 4 reported, "Tragic accident claims young bride. Margaret Carrington, New Blackwood, age 19, drowned Saturday last when she fell from the footbridge at Holloway Creek during an evening walk. Her body was recovered Sunday morning by local fishermen. She is survived by her husband of 2 weeks, Thomas Carrington. The report went on to note that the funeral had been private, attended only by immediate family, and that Margaret had been buried in the Blackwood family plot at St. Michael's Cemetery. A subsequent visit to the cemetery by Carrington confirmed the existence of the grave, though the headstone was weathered to near illegibility, bearing only the name Margaret B. and the year 1908. So Thomas Carrington's first wife had died tragically just weeks after their wedding, and he had remarried less than a year later. This explained why Margaret had been erased from the family narrative. A brief, tragic first marriage, overshadowed by the long and apparently successful union with Catherine. But it didn't explain the peculiarities of the photograph, nor why Carrington's great-aunt Martha, from whom she had inherited the album, had kept it hidden away all these years. The story might have ended there. A sad footnote to the family history, a young bride lost to a tragic accident, a grief-stricken widower who found solace in a new marriage. Many families have such chapters in their histories, painful episodes that are gradually softened by time and retelling until they lose their sharp edges, becoming merely interesting anecdotes rather than wounds that still have the power to hurt. But something about the story didn't sit right with Carrington. The more she learned about her great-grandfather Thomas, the more questions arose. By all accounts, he had been a stern, domineering figure, successful in business, but cold in his personal relationships. Family stories painted him as a strict disciplinarian with his children, particularly his daughters, and a controlling husband who monitored his wife's every movement and relationship. He kept a ledger of the household expenses, Carrington's father told her. Every penny had to be accounted for. If your great-grandmother wanted to buy so much as a spool of thread, she had to justify it to him. That was just how things were done back then, I suppose. But was it? Carrington's research into other families of the era suggested that, while patriarchal authority was certainly the norm, Thomas's level of control had been extreme even by the standards of his time. And there were other troubling hints. Whispered stories of servants who left without notice, of neighbors who gradually ceased to socialize with the family, of Catherine's increasing isolation as the years passed. Most disturbing of all was a throwaway comment from Carrington's father about Thomas's hands. He had these huge, powerful hands, he said. Farm work, you know. I remember being terrified of them as a child. It felt like he could crush you without even trying. Martha Carrington had died in 2015 at the age of 97, having never married. She had been Thomas and Catherine's youngest child, born in 1925, long after the events in question. She couldn't have known Margaret personally, yet she had preserved this photograph when all other traces of Margaret's existence had been expunged from family records. Martha had been something of a family rebel. The only one of Thomas and Catherine's children to pursue higher education, earning a degree in library science in the 1940s, when female academics were still relatively rare. She had spent her career as an archivist at the Wisconsin Historical Society, developing a reputation for her meticulous work in preserving and cataloging historical documents. She had been, in other words, a woman who understood the power of records, the significance of what is kept, and what is discarded. The fact that she had preserved this photograph, hidden it, protected it, suggested that she had recognized its importance as evidence of something that others wished to forget. But evidence of what, exactly? Seeking answers, Carrington turned to the only person who might shed light on the matter, her grandmother Eleanor, Thomas and Catherine's daughter-in-law, who had married their son James in 1938. Now 99 years old and living in a nursing home in Madison, Eleanor was the last living link to that generation of the family. I hesitated to bring it up, Carrington admitted. Grandmother Eleanor has always been proper to a fault, and I wasn't sure how she'd react to questions about family secrets. But I needed to know. When presented with the photograph, Eleanor's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her hands trembled as she took the cabinet card, and her normally composed face crumpled with emotion. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "We thought," They were all destroyed. What followed was a revelation that would forever change Elizabeth Carrington's understanding of her family history. Over the next 2 hours, in a voice that occasionally dropped to a barely audible murmur, Eleanor revealed the truth that had been hidden for nearly 110 years. Thomas Carrington had indeed married Margaret Blackwood in June 1908. The couple had known each other since childhood. Growing up on neighboring farms outside Millfield, their wedding had been a modest affair, typical for farming families of modest means, with a photograph taken the day after the ceremony at the Westfield studio in town. They had moved into a small cottage on the edge of the Carrington property, with plans for Thomas to eventually take over the family farm. 2 weeks after the wedding, Margaret had disappeared. The official story, the one reported in the Millfield Gazette, was that she had drowned accidentally. But Eleanor told a different tale, one passed down to her by her husband James, who had heard it from his mother Catherine on her deathbed in 1942. Margaret didn't drown, Eleanor said, at least not accidentally. Thomas killed her. According to Eleanor, the marriage had soured almost immediately. Thomas, who had always been known for his volatile temper, had become enraged when he discovered that Margaret was not the virginal bride he had expected. In a culture obsessed with female purity and fidelity, such a discovery was catastrophic. During a heated argument on the footbridge at Holloway Creek, Thomas had pushed Margaret into the water and watched as she drowned, making no attempt to save her. The Carrington family, wealthy and influential in the small community, had quickly closed ranks. The local sheriff, a longtime friend of Thomas's father, ruled the death accidental without conducting a thorough investigation. The Blackwood family, poor and powerless, had no recourse to challenge the ruling. Margaret was buried quickly and quietly, and the community moved on, accepting the tragic accident narrative. Less than a year later, Thomas married Catherine Donnelly, the daughter of another prosperous local farmer. Their firstborn son James arrived exactly 9 months after the wedding, followed by 4 more children over the next 15 years. By all accounts, it was a successful union, with Thomas eventually inheriting the Carrington farm and expanding it into one of the largest agricultural operations in the county. Catherine knew what Thomas had done, Eleanor continued. She told James on her deathbed and made him promise never to reveal it. She said she'd spent her whole life atoning for marrying a murderer, trying to make him a better man. And I think she succeeded, to some degree. The Thomas I knew was stern, but not violent. Whatever demons drove him to kill Margaret, he seemed to have conquered them. Or perhaps Catherine just became very good at managing his temper. But if the family had gone to such lengths to conceal the truth, why had the photograph been preserved at all? Why hadn't it been destroyed, along with all other evidence of Margaret's existence? The answer lay in the pendant that had first caught Elizabeth Carrington's attention. According to Eleanor, it had belonged to Margaret's mother, a simple silver locket containing a lock of hair from Margaret's deceased father. It was her most precious possession, a talisman of family connection in an era when such physical mementos carried profound emotional significance. The photograph was taken the day after the wedding, Eleanor explained. Margaret wore the locket instead of having it retouched into the image later, which was sometimes done with jewelry. But look at her face. Really look at it. Elizabeth studied the photograph again. Margaret's expression, which she had initially read as the typical solemnity of period portraiture, now seemed charged with something else. Fear, resignation, a mute appeal. Catherine told James that Thomas had already begun to show his true nature on their wedding night, Eleanor continued. By the time this photograph was taken, Margaret knew she was in danger. She clutched that locket because it was her connection to her parents, her only source of strength, and she looked directly at the camera, hoping that someone, someday, would see the truth in her eyes. The photograph had survived because Martha, Thomas and Catherine's youngest child, had found it hidden among her mother's possessions after Catherine's death. Understanding its significance from fragments of overheard conversations and her own observations of her father's character, she had preserved it, not as a family keepsake, but as evidence of a crime that had gone unpunished. Martha always said there was something wrong with her father, Eleanor said, some darkness in him that Catherine kept in check. She never knew exactly what he'd done, but she suspected it was something terrible. Keeping this photograph was her way of ensuring that Margaret wasn't completely erased from history. Thomas Carrington died in 1956, never facing justice for his crime. The statute of limitations for murder had not yet been established in Wisconsin in the early 20th century, but the passage of time, the death of witnesses, and the lack of forensic evidence made any posthumous investigation impractical. Margaret Blackwood had become, like so many victims of domestic violence throughout history, a ghost at the periphery of a family narrative constructed to exclude her. But the photograph remained, a silent witness. A moment frozen in time, capturing not just two people at the beginning of a brief, tragic union, but a hidden truth that would reverberate through generations. Carrington's investigation might have ended there, with the grim satisfaction of having uncovered the truth about her great-grandfather's crime. But as she delved deeper into historical records, a more complex and disturbing picture began to emerge, not just of Thomas Carrington, but of the society that had enabled and protected him. The first hint came from land records. The Blackwood farm, which had been adjacent to the Carrington property for generations, had been sold to Thomas's father just 3 months after Margaret's death, at a price well below its market value. Margaret's parents, now childless, had moved away from Millfield shortly thereafter, disappearing into the vast anonymity of Chicago. No further record of them could be found. Had they been coerced into selling their land? Had they been paid for their silence about the circumstances of their daughter's death? Or had they simply been unable to bear remaining in a place where justice had been so blatantly denied? Further research revealed a pattern of similar acquisitions by the Carrington family over the decades, small farms purchased at suspiciously low prices, often following some personal crisis for the original owners. Thomas's father, and later Thomas himself, had built their agricultural empire not just through hard work and good management, as family lore insisted, but through a systematic exploitation of others' misfortunes. And there were other victims besides Margaret. Carrington found court records from 1922 showing that a farm laborer named Joseph Raddick had filed assault charges against Thomas, claiming that he had been beaten severely after questioning his wages. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, despite hospital records documenting Raddick's injuries. The judge who dismissed the case was married to Thomas's sister. In 1935, a young woman named Emma Lehman, who worked as a maid in the Carrington household, had left her position abruptly and moved to Minneapolis. 6 months later, she had given birth to a son who, according to birth records, had no father listed. The timing suggested that the child might have been Thomas's, though no proof could be established. But the pattern of female employees leaving the Carrington household under mysterious circumstances was repeated several times in the household accounts. Most disturbing of all was what Carrington discovered about Catherine. Far from being the willing participant in a cover-up that Eleanor's account had suggested, Catherine appeared to have been as much a victim as Margaret, though her suffering had been prolonged over decades rather than ending in a single violent act. Medical records from the county hospital showed that Catherine had been treated for various injuries throughout her marriage: broken ribs in 1912, a fractured wrist in 1917, severe bruising in 1923. Each time, the cause was listed as an accident, a fall from a horse, a mishap with a door, a stumble on the stairs. The pattern was unmistakable to modern eyes, though it had apparently raised no alarms at the time. More poignant were the letters Carrington found among Martha's effects, correspondence between Catherine and her sister in Minneapolis that spanned the entire course of her marriage. Reading between the lines of these carefully worded messages, it became clear that Catherine had lived in constant fear, walking a precarious tightrope to avoid triggering Thomas's rage. Her sister had repeatedly urged her to leave, but Catherine had remained, partly out of economic necessity, partly out of concern for her children, and partly out of a misguided sense of duty informed by the religious and social mores of her time. "I must make the best of the life God has given me," she wrote in 1931. "The children need their father, and I have made my vows before God. It is not for us to question the burdens we are called to bear." This was the true context of the mysterious wedding photograph. Not just evidence of a single murder that had gone unpunished, but a window into a broader pattern of abuse, exploitation, and injustice that had affected multiple lives over many decades. The respected Carrington family, pillars of their community, had built their fortune and reputation on a foundation of violence and coercion, protected by a network of social connections that valued property and appearance over human life and dignity. And at the center of it all was Thomas Carrington, a man whose cruelty had been systematically concealed by those who benefited from their association with him, or who were too afraid to challenge his power. In the years following her discovery, Elizabeth Carrington has worked to piece together Margaret Blackwood's story, combing through census records, school registries, church documents, and the few surviving letters and diaries from the period. The portrait that emerges is of a bright, ambitious young woman who had hoped marriage would provide her with opportunities unavailable to her as the daughter of struggling farmers. Instead, she became the victim of a violent man protected by wealth, social standing, and the pervasive belief that what happened between husband and wife was private, beyond the reach of law or community intervention. "I feel a responsibility to Margaret," Carrington says, "not just because she was, however briefly, part of my family, but because her story represents countless others that have been deliberately forgotten. Women whose lives and deaths were deemed less important than the reputations of the men who harmed them." The wedding photograph now hangs in Elizabeth Carrington's study, not as a celebration of marriage, but as a memorial to a young woman who for over a century was denied even the dignity of being remembered. In Margaret's steady gaze and the protective grip on her mother's locket, Carrington sees not just a victim, but a witness whose testimony, though delayed by generations, has finally been heard. But what of the locket itself, that small silver pendant that first caught Carrington's attention and launched her investigation? What had happened to it after Margaret's death? Here the historical record offers only tantalizing fragments. According to Eleanor, the locket had not been found on Margaret's body when it was recovered from Holloway Creek. This suggested that it had either been lost in the struggle that preceded her drowning, or, more likely, that Thomas had taken it, perhaps fearing that it might somehow implicate him in her death. Catherine had never mentioned seeing the locket among Thomas's possessions, but she had once told James a curious story about Thomas's obsession with the creek where Margaret had died. He would often walk there alone, she said, especially on the anniversary of Margaret's death, and he had forbidden anyone else in the family from visiting that spot, claiming that the bridge was unsafe and the currents treacherous. After Thomas's death in 1956, his personal effects had included a small locked box that no one could open. Catherine had insisted that it be buried with him, unopened, a request that had struck the family as odd, but had been honored nonetheless. Had the locket been inside that box? Had Thomas kept it all those years as a macabre trophy of his crime? Or had it been lost forever in the muddy waters of Holloway Creek, along with the truth about Margaret's death? Carrington's investigation took an unexpected turn when she decided to visit the site of Margaret's drowning. Holloway Creek still ran through what had once been Carrington land, though the property had been sold decades earlier and was now part of a nature preserve. The original footbridge was long gone, replaced by a modern structure slightly upstream from the historical location. Using old maps and photographs, Carrington was able to identify the approximate spot where the original bridge had stood. The creek was narrow but deep at that point, with steep banks and a strong current even in summer, certainly dangerous enough that a fall could be fatal, especially for someone who, like many women of her era, probably could not swim. On an impulse, Carrington hired a metal detectorist to search the creek bed near the former bridge site. She had little hope of finding anything significant after more than a century, but felt compelled to try nonetheless. The search yielded the usual assortment of modern detritus, coins, pull tabs, a few pieces of farm equipment. But, just as they were about to give up, the detector signaled a find in a deep pool just downstream from where the bridge had stood. What emerged from the mud, after careful cleaning by a conservator, was a small silver locket, tarnished almost black with age but still intact. Inside was a lock of reddish-brown hair, preserved by the airtight seal of the locket's design. DNA testing would later confirm that the hair shared genetic markers with Margaret's maternal cousins, still living in Minnesota. It had indeed belonged to her father, just as family lore had claimed. The discovery of the locket provided physical confirmation of Eleanor's story. More importantly, it established a direct connection to Margaret herself. Not just an image on faded photographic paper, but something she had touched, had worn against her skin, had clutched in her final moments as she faced the man who would take her life. For Carrington, the locket became a tangible link to a woman she had never met, but whose fate had become inextricably entwined with her own. "I sometimes hold it and try to imagine what she was thinking in those final moments," she says. Was she afraid? Was she defiant? Did she understand what was about to happen to her? The mystery of how the locket ended up in the creek remains unresolved. Perhaps Thomas had tried to throw it into the deepest part of the water but misjudged. Perhaps Margaret had managed to hide it from him as she fought for her life. Or perhaps, as some might prefer to believe, it found its way back to the site of her death through some agency beyond rational explanation, a final testament to a truth that refused to remain buried. But the story of the 1908 wedding portrait raises disturbing questions that extend far beyond one family's hidden history. How many other photographs from that era, now viewed as quaint relics of a more innocent time, conceal similar tragedies? How many family trees have been carefully pruned to remove inconvenient branches? How many of our understanding of the past has been shaped not by what happened, but by what those with power decided should be remembered? The Victorians and Edwardians were masters of symbolic communication. The language of flowers, the positioning of jewelry, the subtle indicators of status and intention all formed a complex system of meaning that modern viewers often miss entirely. They were equally adept at concealment, at presenting respectable facades that obscured messy realities. The photographs they left behind are not transparent windows into the past, but carefully constructed representations that both reveal and conceal. In recent years, scholars have begun to approach these historical images with greater skepticism, looking beyond the formal poses and proper attire to the human stories they might be trying to tell. The wedding portrait of Margaret and Thomas Carrington serves as a powerful reminder that even the most conventional image may contain, for those willing to look closely enough, evidence of hidden truths. Consider the physical arrangement of the couple in the photograph. The space between them, while typical of the formal portraiture of the era, takes on new significance when viewed through the lens of what we now know about their relationship. Thomas stands slightly behind Margaret, his hand not quite touching her shoulder, a pose that suggests possession without intimacy, control without affection. And then there's Margaret's expression. To modern eyes accustomed to smiling subjects, most Victorian and Edwardian portrait subjects appear solemn, even sad. But looking more carefully at Margaret's face, one can detect something beyond the conventional solemnity of the period, a tension around the eyes, a slight asymmetry to the set of the mouth that suggests barely contained emotion. Is it fear? Resignation? A mute appeal to future viewers? We can never know with certainty, but the possibility that she was trying to communicate across time adds a haunting dimension to this seemingly conventional image. Most telling of all is the locket, clutched so tightly in Margaret's pale fingers. In an era when wedding portraits typically emphasize the ring as symbol of the marital bond, Margaret's focus on this connection to her parents reads as a silent protest, a refusal to fully inhabit her new role as Thomas's wife. Whether consciously or instinctively, she chose to center not her marriage, but her original family, her identity before Thomas claimed her. And perhaps there's something else to consider, something that transcends the specific tragedy of Margaret Blackwood Carrington. In preserving and hiding this photograph, Martha Carrington engaged in an act of witness that spanned decades, ensuring that evidence of her father's crime would eventually come to light. In doing so, she created a bridge across time, connecting her half-sister's brief life to future generations who would otherwise never have known of her existence. The photograph, then, serves as both evidence and memorial, a testament to violence concealed and truth preserved. It reminds us that history is not just what is prominently displayed in family albums and local museums, but also what is hidden away in attics and basements, waiting for someone curious enough, brave enough, to bring it into the light. As for Margaret Blackwood Carrington, her grave in St. Michael's Cemetery has recently received a new headstone bearing her full name, dates of birth and death, and the simple epitaph, "Truth emerges from silence." On the anniversary of her death each year, Elizabeth Carrington places flowers there, not the roses or lilies typical of Victorian mourning, but forget-me-nots, those small blue flowers that the Victorians themselves recognized as symbols of remembrance and fidelity to those who have been lost. In doing so, she honors not just a long-dead relative, but all those whose stories have been suppressed, whose lives have been deemed expendable, whose truths have been buried beneath more convenient narratives. The wedding photograph from 1908 revealed one family's shocking secret, but it also reveals something larger about how history is constructed, not just through what we choose to remember, but through what we deliberately forget. And yet, as Margaret's story demonstrates, even the most carefully hidden truths have a way of eventually emerging into the light. The photograph that was meant to document a supposedly happy beginning instead became evidence of a tragic ending. But in its rediscovery, it offers something else. A belated justice, a reclaiming of narrative, and a reminder that those who seek to erase the past often underestimate the power of a single image to speak across generations. Carrington's investigation has had ripple effects beyond her own family. Her meticulous documentation of Margaret's story and its subsequent suppression has inspired other historians and genealogists to look more critically at family photographs and narratives from the period. In several cases, similar patterns of erasure have been identified. Women who disappeared from family histories, whose deaths were explained away with convenient accidents, whose replacements stepped seamlessly into their roles with suspicious speed. In one particularly striking parallel, a researcher in Minnesota discovered that her great-grandfather had had 3 wives in quick succession between 1902 and 1908, each of whom had died under ambiguous circumstances. The deaths had been attributed to illness, accident, and suicide respectively, but documentary evidence suggested foul play in at least 2 cases. As in the Carrington case, the husband had been protected by his social position and family connections, allowing him to continue his predatory behavior over many years. What's most disturbing about these cases, Carrington observes, is not just that these men got away with murder, but that entire communities were complicit in the cover-up. Everyone knew, or at least suspected, what had happened, but social cohesion was deemed more important than justice for the victims. This perspective adds another layer of meaning to the wedding portrait of Margaret and Thomas. The photographer who took it, Augustus Westfield, had been a respected member of the Millfield community, known for his technical skill and artistic sensitivity. Had he sensed something amiss in the couple who posed before his camera that day? Had he noticed Margaret's distress, her death grip on her mother's locket? And if so, had he chosen to ignore these signs, to produce the conventional image his client expected? We'll never know what Westfield thought as he arranged the young couple before his painted backdrop, as he checked the lighting and exposure, as he instructed them to remain perfectly still for the long seconds required by his camera. But his professional decision to create a seemingly normal wedding portrait, rather than to somehow document the undercurrents of fear and control that were apparently visible even at this early stage of the marriage, makes him part of the social machinery that ultimately enabled Thomas's crime. Photography itself played an ambiguous role in this story. On one hand, it served as a tool of concealment, creating idealized images that conformed to social expectations rather than revealing uncomfortable truths. On the other, it preserved evidence that might otherwise have been lost entirely, allowing Margaret's story to eventually emerge from the shadows of deliberate forgetting. This duality, photography as both concealer and revealer of truth, continues to shape our understanding of history. Even today, with our awareness of how easily images can be manipulated and our skepticism about the objectivity of the photographic record, we still tend to trust what we see. A photograph feels like evidence in a way that text does not. Its apparent transparency, lending it an authority that more obviously mediated forms of representation lack. But the wedding portrait of Margaret and Thomas Carrington reminds us that photographs have always been constructed, not just technically, through choices of framing, lighting, and composition, but socially and culturally, through decisions about what is worth documenting and how it should be presented. The formal conventions of wedding portraiture in 1908 didn't just reflect aesthetic preferences, they reinforced social norms about marriage, gender, and family that served to maintain existing power structures, including those that enabled men like Thomas to abuse with impunity. Look again at that wedding portrait, at the solemn faces, the formal poses, the careful arrangement of bodies in space, but this time, look deeper. See the fear in Margaret's eyes, the tension in her fingers as they clutch her mother's locket. See the coldness in Thomas's gaze, the slight distance between their bodies that speaks of more than just Victorian propriety. See the truth that was always there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to really see it. The wedding photo from 1908 revealed a shocking secret, but perhaps the real shock is how many other secrets remain hidden in the photographs we've inherited. Frozen moments from the past that, if we learn to read them correctly, might tell us truths about our histories that no one ever intended us to know. When Elizabeth Carrington first discovered the wedding portrait of Margaret and Thomas, she had no idea that it would lead her not just to uncover a family secret, but to confront the larger systems of power and silence that made that secret possible. She had thought she was simply researching her genealogy, filling in the branches of a family tree. Instead, she found herself excavating the foundations of that tree, discovering the dark soil from which it had grown. For those of us who come after, who inherit these photographic records, these family stories, these carefully curated histories, there's both an opportunity and a responsibility. We can accept the official narratives, the sanitized versions of the past that have been handed down to us. Or we can look more closely, ask more questions, seek out the silences and erasures that might point to more complicated, more disturbing truths. The wedding photo from 1908 is just one image from one family, but it stands as a reminder of how much of history, especially women's history, especially the history of those without power, has been deliberately obscured. It challenges us to become more careful readers of the past, to look beyond the surface of the images and stories we've inherited to the human realities they both reveal and conceal. And it asks us to consider our own role in determining what will be remembered and what will be forgotten. What stories are we choosing to tell about our own time? Whose experiences are we centering, and whose are we pushing to the margins? What photographs will we leave behind, and what will they say or fail to say about the world we inhabited? These are not just academic questions. As Margaret Blackwood Carrington's story demonstrates, the stakes of historical memory are profound. When we allow certain stories to be erased, certain voices to be silenced, we don't just distort the record of the past. We enable the continuation of the very injustices we're refusing to acknowledge. But when we insist on confronting the past, honestly, on recovering the stories that have been suppressed, on listening to the voices that speak to us across time, whether through written records, oral histories, or images like the 1908 wedding portrait, we open up the possibility of a more just future. We affirm that every life matters, that every story deserves to be told, that truth, however painful, is preferable to comforting lies. The photograph of Margaret and Thomas Carrington has, in a sense, achieved what Margaret might have hoped for when she clutched her mother's locket and stared into the camera's lens. It has become a testament, a witness, a cry for recognition that has finally been heard. Though justice in the conventional sense is no longer possible, the perpetrator long dead, the crime beyond the reach of earthly courts, there is a different kind of justice in the act of remembering, of honoring, of refusing to let Margaret's story be erased again. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of this haunting image. The past is never truly past, never safely contained in albums and archives. It continues to live in the present, shaping our understanding of who we are and what is possible. The wedding photo from 1908 speaks to us still, across more than a century of change, reminding us that the struggle for truth and justice is never finally won or lost, but continues with each generation, with each act of witness, with each refusal to accept the convenient lies that power tells about itself. Look once more at Margaret's face, at her steady gaze meeting yours across time. She is no longer just a victim, a footnote, a branch pruned from a family tree. She has become what she perhaps always wanted to be, a witness, a truth-teller, a woman whose story matters. Through the strange alchemy of photography and history, she has transcended the limitations of her time and place, speaking to us now with an urgency that cannot be denied. The truth was never meant to be known. But now that you know it, what will you do?